Manhattan lay under a smothering curtain of white, a city that never slept, forced into silence by a level 4 blizzard that swallowed sound and light alike. The streets below the Wolf Technologies penthouse were empty except for the swirling snow, each gust bending against the towers like a living force searching for entry. Mira Dalton had not meant to be anywhere near the 62nd floor tonight, but she had taken the emergency shift because the overtime pay nudged her closer to covering her mother's latest hospital bill. She stepped into the service elevator with a tired breath, clutching her cleaning kit and trying to ignore the way the lights flickered overhead. The storm outside had pushed Manhattan's power grid beyond its limit, and every hallway in the high-rise trembled with the strain. As the elevator rattled upward, a sharp jolt rocked the cabin. Mira gasped and grabbed the railing. The panel lights blinked from white to an eerie amber glow. She pressed the button for the 58th floor again, but the elevator ignored her command and kept climbing as if pulled by something unseen. The doors finally slid open with a long metallic groan. Mira stepped out cautiously. The hallway was unlit except for a red emergency strip running along the floor like a warning vane. Cold air seeped through the vents, drifting in slow curls across the concrete walls. This was not the regular Maid floor. This level felt abandoned, unfinished, wrong. Mira whispered to herself that she only needed to find the stairwell and head back down. She turned the corner and froze. A tall digital display, mounted to the wall, flickered through static before stabilizing on an alert. Potential unauthorized access detected. She felt a pulse of confusion. There was no one here except her, and she certainly did not belong to the restricted staff listed on the door panel. The cameras above her blinked sluggishly, their feed glitching from the storm interference. She had no idea that they could not tag her as a permitted worker, or that the glitch made this entire floor appear as a dead zone. She only knew she needed to keep moving. She followed the red glow until it led her to a darkened lounge lined with glass walls. Beyond them, Manhattan blurred into a white fog. The air smelled like cedar smoke and cold metal. A faint thud echoed from deeper inside the room. Mira hesitated before stepping into the vast penthouse space, lit only by scattered emergency lamps. Then she saw movement. A figure emerged from the far shadows, broad-shouldered, tall-breath, rising in uneven bursts. Elias Wolf, the CEO, whose name dominated business headlines, stepped forward with a rigid posture that suggested he was fighting something inside himself. His right hand was red across the knuckles, the skin marked from impact against the stone wall behind him. He inhaled sharply when he saw her, as though the sight of another person cut through whatever storm he was struggling against. Mira opened her mouth to explain, but he lifted his hand in a trembling halt. "Stop right there." His voice was rough frayed, at the edges almost begging. "Do not take another step." The red lights carved a harsh glow across his face, illuminating eyes that looked both terrified and desperate. Mira blinked in confusion, thinking he meant danger from the storm or a structural issue. She instinctively took one step forward to ask if he was hurt. He flinched, as if struck by the motion, bracing a hand against the wall, while his breath hitched. "Do not come any closer. I lose control." The words sounded torn from him, not a threat but a confession dragged from the deepest part of a man who had spent too long alone with feelings he could not tame. Snow slammed against the glass in a violent roar, and the lights trembled above them. Mira stood still, heart pounding. She had walked into something she did not understand, something dangerous not because of violence, but because of the raw emotion clinging to the air between them, like static. And despite the warning trembling in his voice, despite the storm battering the world outside, Mira took another careful step forward, drawn by something she could not name. Her voice steadied as she whispered that she only wanted to help, but the statement made his shoulders tense, as if the idea shook something hidden inside him. The storm howled, rattling the glass panels until they seemed ready to splinter. Elias straightened, fighting for breath, fighting for control, looking at her as if she was both danger and refuge. Mira's pulse raced, yet she stepped further into the dim red room. He whispered her name like a plea. That night. Mira Dalton had learned long ago that courage did not always look like running into danger or lifting impossible weights. Sometimes it was waking up before sunrise to catch 2 buses into Manhattan. Sometimes it was holding down 3 jobs while pretending she was not exhausted. And sometimes it was simply choosing to hope when life kept giving her reasons not to. She had grown up in a cramped apartment in Queens, where the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors argue, and the winters slipped cold through the cracks. But inside that apartment lived the one person who made everything bearable. Her mother, Lacey Dalton, had always been bright and warm, the kind of woman who could make a home feel full even when the fridge was nearly empty. But a heart defect diagnosed only months ago had changed everything. The medical bills stacked higher each week, and even with insurance, the numbers felt impossible. Mira had watched her mother weaken to the point of struggling to breathe on the walk from the bedroom to the kitchen. Each time her mother tried to smile and insisted she was fine, Mira felt something inside her tighten with fear and fierce determination. She had promised herself she would keep her mother alive no matter what it cost, and that meant taking every shift she could find, including tonight's emergency placement in the penthouse of a man she had only heard rumors about. Her first job was cleaning rooms at a midtown hotel, scrubbing carpets and changing sheets between corporate guests. Her second job was waitressing at a small diner that smelled like burnt coffee and fried eggs. Her third was tutoring children in her neighborhood, helping them with homework, while she tried to ignore her own unfinished textbooks on the shelf. Years ago, she had dreamed of becoming an interior designer, had even earned a scholarship to study design at a community college. She loved color palettes, natural lighting, and the way a room could be transformed with small details. But she had dropped out when the bills became too heavy and her mother's health took a turn. Responsibility came before dreams. It always had. That was why she had said yes when the Maid agency called her an hour before the blizzard warning went out offering double pay to cover a last-minute cancellation at the Wolf penthouse. She had not known she would be stepping into the restricted floor of one of the most powerful men in Manhattan. She had not known he would be there at all. Her supervisor told her he rarely visited in person and preferred to manage everything through remote systems. Some staff whispered that he disliked people entirely. Others said he had fired half his security team last year because someone had spoken too loudly near his office. Mira did not know what to believe. She only knew she needed the money, and the promise of overtime meant she could make at least a dent in the emergency invoice due at the end of the month. Her mother had tried to protest when she rushed out the door earlier that evening, telling her the storm was too dangerous and she should stay home, but Mira had kissed her forehead and promised to return before midnight. She did not expect the power outages, the elevator malfunction, or the unsettling emptiness that greeted her when she stepped onto the 62nd floor. Even now, with Elias Wolf standing only a few feet away and warning her with a voice that shook as though he was holding back some invisible force, Mira's instinct was not fear. It was concern. Her quiet courage came from surviving years of uncertainty, years of learning that panic never helped, and fear only grew if she let it. She had lived in neighborhoods where sirens echoed through the night and learned to remain steady even when the world tilted. She had walked home after midnight shifts, with her keys between her fingers navigating dark blocks, without letting her heartbeat guide her decisions. She had comforted children whose parents never came home on time and soothed elderly tenants when the building heat failed. She had held her mother's hand through emergency room visits and listened to doctors deliver news that made her stomach drop. Through all of it, she had kept her composure, kept her compassion, kept her ability to read a room better than most. It was why she noticed the way Elias Wolf's chest rose and fell too quickly, why she saw his trembling hands, not as anger, but as a man overwhelmed. She noticed the way he avoided her eyes, the way he positioned himself near the wall, as if needing something solid to anchor his body. She noticed how his warning was not sharp, but strained, how it held the shape of fear, not aggression. She had met dangerous men before, men who shouted at diner staff, or slammed doors, or used their size to intimidate. Elias was none of those things. His presence filled the room, but not with cruelty. More like a man trying desperately to hold himself back from stepping toward her. The truth was, Elias Wolf had seen Mira long before she saw him. He had caught glimpses of her on security cameras weeks ago when she first joined the maintenance rotation. He had noticed the way she worked quietly, how she never complained, how she hummed under her breath when she cleaned as if music reminded her to breathe. He noticed the way she paused to straighten something that was not part of her job description or to help another staff member lift heavy bins. He had recognized something in her demeanor, something gentle but grounded, something that pulled at the parts of him he thought he had sealed away. But Mira did not know any of that. She only knew that a man who looked like he could command entire boardrooms was standing in front of her, trembling like he was afraid to even breathe near her. She knew what fear looked like. She also knew what loneliness looked like. And there was a depth in his eyes that mirrored both. The contrast between their worlds could not have been sharper. She came from Queens, where sirens were lullabies and dreams were fragile things. He came from the glittering top floors of Manhattan, from wealth and surveillance and the constant pressure of a corporate empire. She scrubbed floors for a living. He owned the floors. She worked double shifts to keep her mother alive. He signed deals that shifted the future of entire industries. And still here, they stood both trapped by the storm, both breathing the same uneasy air, both far more vulnerable than either expected to be. Mira's courage was not loud, but quiet, steady, shaped by years of surviving what should have broken her. And Elias, through the haze of fear and adrenaline and unfiltered emotion, felt that steadiness reach him like a lifeline. The cameras that had once shown him her face now revealed her presence in real time, and it shook him harder than any storm outside. She was not just someone who walked into the wrong room. She was someone he had noticed before, someone who unknowingly disrupted the order he had forced upon his life. And now, as the storm tightened its grip on the city and the penthouse flickered with unstable power, Mira Dalton was the one person he could not push away, even when he tried. Her quiet courage made his warnings falter, his breath catch, and his control slip by degrees he could not stop. And as she stepped closer, he knew this night would not end the way either of them expected. Elias Wolf had spent most of his life perfecting the art of appearing unshakable. The kind of man whose presence filled boardrooms, whose decisions shifted markets, and whose silence alone commanded entire teams to rearrange their priorities. People often described him as intense, disciplined, and brilliant, a man carved from marble and sharpened by ambition. Yet none of them knew that beneath the immaculate suits and the controlled expressions lived a storm he had been battling since childhood, a storm he rarely allowed anyone to see. He had grown up under the heavy grip of the Wolf family legacy, a dynasty built on generational wealth and exacting standards. His mother, elegant and cold, cared more about appearances than affection, and his father treated emotion as a flaw to be eliminated. As a boy, Elias learned to stay quiet unless spoken to keep his face neutral, to swallow every feeling before it could surface. He learned early that vulnerability invited punishment, that even joy could be dangerous if it disrupted the rigid order of the household. When he was 8 years old, he cried after losing a school competition, and his father gripped his shoulders so hard he left bruises scolding him until the boy's tears stopped from sheer exhaustion. When he was 12, he laughed too loudly during a family dinner and was sent to his room for the rest of the night for being disruptive. By 15, he had already become an expert at hiding everything that made him human, but hiding came at a cost. In his late teens, he discovered what therapists would later call emotional flooding, an internal surge where feelings intensified to a degree he could not control. A single spark of anger, fear, or connection could grow into a tidal wave that overwhelmed him, leaving him shaking or shutting down entirely. Instead of receiving help, he was told to suppress it, to fight it, to treat his own emotions like an enemy. He learned to build walls so thick that not even his closest advisors could read him. When he inherited Wolf Technologies, at 27 after his father's sudden heart failure, the world assumed he would embrace the spotlight. Instead, he withdrew even further, running the empire through carefully orchestrated routines that kept him distant from everyone. He minimized meetings, avoided social events, and communicated through digital channels whenever possible. He rarely allowed himself to stand near someone long enough to feel anything at all. It was easier to remain distant than risk losing control. Then came the relationship he wished he could erase from memory. A 2-year romance with a woman named Serena, who initially found his intensity charming until it became too much for her. She told him she loved him at first, then accused him of feeling too strongly, of reacting too deeply, of caring in a way she could not handle. She broke up with him after a bitter argument during which she called him unstable and overwhelming. The breakup hollowed him out and confirmed his deepest fear that something inside him was inherently flawed. He vowed never to let anyone get close enough to trigger that part of him again. For almost 5 years, he kept that promise. He surrounded himself with distance-built routines that protected him from unexpected interactions and ensured that most of the penthouse staff rotated before they could grow familiar enough to connect. Yet even with all his caution, he could not stop himself from noticing Mira the first time he saw her through the grainy camera feed on one of the maintenance floors. It was not attraction at first. It was recognition. Something about the way she moved with quiet purpose, the way she checked on another maid who had dropped her supplies, the way she paused to straighten a crooked picture frame made something stir inside him. He dismissed it at first, convincing himself it was a one-time reaction. But it was not. The cameras caught glimpses of her throughout the following weeks, and every time her image flickered across the screen, he felt that same unfamiliar tightening in his chest. She had a softness he did not understand, paired with a quiet resilience that he recognized from a distance. He hated that he noticed her. He hated the way his pulse skipped. He hated the way the sight of her made his breath catch, in a way he had not felt in years. So he told himself she was simply another employee, and tried to ignore the way his mind drifted back to her after long workdays. He did not realize how deep her presence had embedded itself in him until tonight when she stepped into his private level, and something inside him snapped with a force he could neither predict nor contain. Seeing her in that dim red light, framed by the storm raging behind the windows, struck him like a blow. His emotional defenses trembled. The familiar rise beginning in his chest, the rush of adrenaline he feared more than any business crisis. His breath grew uneven, his hands trembled, and the pressure behind his ribs built so fast he thought he might collapse. He had spent years training himself to keep distance, to control the rise before it consumed him, yet the moment Mira stepped into the room, everything he had built threatened to crumble. Her presence hit him with an intensity he could not process. It terrified him because he knew where this path led. He knew what happened when he grew attached. He knew the destruction that could follow. But what scared him most was not the intensity of the emotion. It was the gentleness of it. The way she looked at him with worry instead of fear. The way she stepped closer instead of backing away. The way she seemed to sense the turmoil inside him without recoiling. That softness was dangerous. It made him want. It made him feel. It made him lose control. He felt everything too much, always had. And Mira Dalton was the first person in years who made that truth impossible to bury. He had lived so long behind emotional armor that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone see him without judgment. But when her eyes met his, he felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and strangely grounding. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside him, yet he felt her presence, cut through the chaos steady and warm, despite her own fear. And as the blizzard roared and the penthouse flickered with unstable power, Elias Wolf understood something he had spent half his life avoiding. He was not afraid of Mira. He was afraid of the way he could not stop feeling when she was near. Manhattan had endured countless winters, but nothing in recent years compared to the blizzard now swallowing the skyline. The storm tightened its icy grip around the city like a living thing pushing against skyscrapers with fists of wind that rattled steel frames and made windows tremble in their casings. Snow swept across the skyline in thick, furious waves that blurred the lights of the avenues until the entire city looked drowned beneath a white ocean. Inside the Wolf Technologies penthouse, the temperature began to drop in small degrees that hinted at a deeper problem. The power grid was buckling under the storm's weight, and even luxury high-rises were not immune to the strain. Mira tried to steady herself, rubbing her hands together as cold drifted through the vents like an unwelcome guest. She wrapped her arms around her torso, not wanting to show how much she was shaking, but the chill bit at her cheeks until they burned. Elias noticed. Even through the haze of fear and emotions he tried so hard to contain, he saw the way her shoulders curled inward. Without a word, he peeled off the thick charcoal sweater he wore over his shirt, his movements abrupt but not aggressive, then stepped forward just close enough to extend the sweater toward her. Here he said quietly, and though his voice trembled, the softness in it was unmistakable. Mira hesitated because the gesture felt intimate in a way she had not expected, but the cold stole her breath and left her fingers numb. She took the sweater, her fingertips brushing his, and a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with fabric shot through him so powerfully he had to look away. Mira slipped it over her head, the heavy wool carrying just the faintest trace of cedar and something warm she could not name. The penthouse lights flickered again, then steadied, then flickered harder, as if the building was fighting a losing battle. A low, dull hum beneath the floor signaled that the emergency generators were preparing to activate. Mira glanced toward the windows where snow slammed with violent persistence. "Is it always this bad in storms like this?" she asked, but Elias shook his head with a tightness in his jaw that made clear he was calculating more than weather patterns. "This one came too fast," he said, watching the lights flicker again. The systems were not ready. His gaze swept to the digital panel mounted near the bar displaying the building's power levels and diagnostics. Mira followed his eyes and saw the numbers drop in small increments that felt like countdowns. She wrapped his sweater tighter around her. The penthouse began to dim even further, and a sudden groan echoed through the walls as the heating system stuttered and fell silent. The temperature dropped faster. Elias moved toward the smart control panel and tapped the screen, but it refused to respond. The storm must have hit the backup circuits. Mira felt her breath turn into visible white clouds. Her teeth chattered despite her efforts to remain composed. Elias swallowed hard, noticing her struggle. "Stay close to the fireplace," he said, as he moved to ignite the gas line manually. But just as he crouched down, Mira saw something else steal his attention. His phone lying on the marble counter began vibrating nonstop. The screen lit the darkened room with harsh white light. Mira glanced at it reflexively, and her breath caught when she read the headline flashing across multiple notifications. Wolf Technologies stock crashing. Alleged data breach under investigation. Anonymous claims involvement. Elias froze. For one suspended moment, he looked as if the world had cracked beneath his feet. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm now flashing across his phone. He picked it up with a tight grip, scanning the alerts with rapid movements that betrayed the panic clawing at his composure. "This cannot be happening tonight," he whispered, but Mira heard everything in his voice that he was trying not to show. She stepped a little closer, though she kept enough distance to respect the warning he had given her earlier. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. His throat worked as he tried to swallow the rising wave of adrenaline. "Reports are saying there was a breach in our security network. Several terabytes of internal data leaked. Stock is dropping almost 12% already. That is impossible. Our system is not that vulnerable." Mira did not understand the technical details, but she recognized the look of a man fighting fear and fury at the same time. Another blast of snow slammed against the windows, shaking the frames. The penthouse lights flickered again, then cut into a dim red glow, the emergency mode kicking in. A deep mechanical thud reverberated through the building as the backup generator signaled partial failure. The room fell into heavy shadows. Elias inhaled a sharp breath, trying to stay in control. He pressed both hands against the counter, bracing himself. The storm outside had made him tense already, but the breach, the plummeting stock, the media firestorm building, with every passing second, it all sent his emotional balance spiraling toward the edge. Mira stepped toward him without thinking. "Do you need help?" she asked. Something in her voice reached him, grounding him just enough that his shoulders lost a fraction of their tension. "You should go to the lower floors," he said, voice strained. "The penthouse might lose heat soon." Mira shook her head. "The elevator is dead. The stairwell door requires a keycard from inside your system. I cannot leave even if I wanted to." A conflicted look crossed his face, one that mirrored fear and something else he refused to name. The storm howled like an animal. Something groaned in the high-rise walls, followed by a crack that echoed through the ceiling. Mira jumped, but Elias moved protectively, his eyes scanning for structural danger. "It is just the wind pressure," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. He looked toward the windows where the city had vanished behind a wall of white. Then the temperature dropped dangerously. Mira shivered violently, pulling the sweater tighter as her breath fogged in front of her. Elias saw it and felt guilt punch into his chest with painful force. The sweater was not enough. The penthouse would not hold heat much longer. He opened a cabinet and grabbed a heavy blanket, moving toward her with tense, purposeful steps. "Take this," he said, thrusting it toward her without allowing himself to get too close. She wrapped it around herself gratefully. The penthouse continued to dim the emergency lights, weakening as the blizzard raged harder. The cold seeped through their bones, and even Elias could feel his control slipping under the weight of fear adrenaline and something far more dangerous. He could not lose control, not tonight, Not in front of her, but the world was falling apart faster than he could breathe through it, and Mira Dalton, wrapped in his sweater and shivering in the red light, was the last person he wanted near him, and the only person he wanted near him all at once. Mira had no intention of wandering deeper into the penthouse, but the sound that echoed through the dim hallway did not feel like something she could ignore. It was a soft metallic clatter, followed by a muffled thump that reverberated through the walls. For a moment she thought it was the storm, but the noise came from inside, not outside. Wrapped in Elias's sweater and clutching the blanket around her shoulders, she stepped cautiously toward the far end of the penthouse, where a frosted glass door stood half open. Red emergency lights cast long shadows that stretched across the polished marble floor. She hesitated at the threshold, listening. The storm raged outside, but somewhere behind the door was another disturbance, something human and unsteady. She pushed the door open slowly, bracing herself for another malfunction or maybe a fallen object. Instead, she found herself standing in a room unlike anything she expected. It was large and warm-toned. Despite the emergency lighting, its walls lined with framed music sheets, photographs of concert halls, and shelves of vinyl records. A grand piano sat at the center of the room, black and glossy, its lid closed but still majestic, even in the dim red glow. The space felt lived in personal nothing like the cold minimalist luxury of the rest of the penthouse. Mira stepped inside, drawn by the intimacy of it. She reached out to touch the edge of a shelf, running her fingers along the worn spines of music books, some annotated with pencil markings. She knew enough about design to recognize when a room carried meaning, and this one was heavy with it. She turned toward a set of framed photographs arranged neatly on the wall and saw a younger Elias playing piano on a stage lit by a soft amber spotlight. His face was focused but calm, almost gentle. The contrast with the tense man she had met minutes ago made her chest tighten with an ache she could not explain. Then she heard the intake of breath behind her. Elias stood in the doorway, his posture rigid, his eyes wide with something that bordered on panic. His gaze shot from her to the piano, to the shelves of music sheets, as though the very air in the room had become too heavy for him to breathe. "You should not be here," he said, but the words came out strained rather than angry. Mira turned gently. "I heard a noise. I thought something might have fallen. I am sorry, I did not mean to intrude." His jaw tightened as if he were trying to hold something back. His hand gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles whitened. "This is my private level. No one comes in here, ever." Mira lowered her gaze, slightly not in fear, but in apology. "I understand. I will leave." But when she moved toward the door, Elias stepped back abruptly, his breath catching in a sharp exhale as though her proximity threatened to unravel him. "Do not come closer. I am barely holding myself together." The confession hit her with a force she did not expect. It was not the warning of a man who wanted control. It was the desperation of someone who feared losing it. She froze where she was watching him. His chest rose and fell in quick, uneven bursts. His hands trembled at his sides. The storm outside thundered against the glass, but in this room, the atmosphere was tight, charged, and deeply fragile. Mira looked around again with new understanding. The carefully arranged music sheets, the worn book spines, the soft lighting, the grand piano that looked both loved and abandoned. This room was not just private, it was vulnerable. It held a version of him he had buried beneath years of restraint and distance. The silence between them stretched until Elias finally spoke again, each word sounding pulled from his lungs with effort. "I stopped playing years ago." Mira's brows furrowed gently. "Why?" "Because music makes me feel too much." His voice cracked on the last two words. Mira's breath hitched. She did not step closer, remembering his warning, but she softened her expression, letting her compassion speak for her. This storm, the outage, the breach, this room. It is all too much at once, she said quietly, stating what was obvious yet unspoken. Elias's gaze flicked up at her, and for the first time that night, she saw something raw in his eyes. A mixture of fear and longing buried beneath 10 years of emotional armor. "You should go back to the lounge," he said, but there was no force in his voice, only a plea. "I do not want to hurt you." Mira held her breath, not because she feared him, but because she feared what he feared. "You have not hurt me," she whispered. Elias pressed a trembling hand against the piano, as if he needed it to keep from falling apart. "That is the problem." Mira's heart tightened. She looked at his shaking hands, his hunched shoulders the way his breath came in shallow tremors. She recognized someone who had carried too much alone, and was terrified of what would happen if he let even one emotion slip through the cracks. He turned away from her, gripping the back of a chair so hard the wood creaked. "I cannot have you in here," he said through clenched teeth. "Not tonight. Not when everything inside me is already shaking." His vulnerability pulled her in deeper than any display of power ever could. She nodded slowly. "I will go," she said softly. But before she could step out, a violent gust slammed against the building, making the lights flicker wildly. Mira stumbled, grabbing the edge of a table to steady herself. Elias turned toward her instinctively, one step taken without thinking. Then he stopped himself mid-sentence, chest rising sharply, as if he realized he had crossed a line within himself. His hands curled into fists. He was fighting something she could not see, something inside him that seemed ready to ignite at the smallest trigger. Mira watched him, her breath shallow but steady. She had seen men lose control, from anger, from rage, from ego. But Elias was none of those things. His fear came from intensity, not violence, from wanting, not domination, from emotion, not impulse. She did not understand the pull between them, but she felt it. The storm outside raged, but the storm inside this room felt even more powerful. Elias finally lifted his gaze to meet hers with a look that shook her to her core. "Please leave this room," he whispered, "not because I do not want you here, but because I want it too much." Mira swallowed hard, sensing that stepping closer would cross a boundary neither of them could retreat from. She backed toward the door, her eyes never leaving his. He exhaled with visible relief and heartbreak as she slipped out of the private level and gently closed the door behind her. On the other side, Elias pressed both palms against the piano, his breath collapsing into a quiet shudder, knowing he had come closer to losing control in those few minutes than he had in years. The moment Mira stepped out of the private level and the door clicked shut behind her, the penthouse seemed to tighten around her like a living thing. The storm outside had deepened into a violent force that pushed against the glass walls with relentless fury, each gust sending tremors through the building. The emergency lights continued their weak red pulse, casting everything in a dim glow that flickered like a failing heartbeat. Mira pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and took slow breaths to steady herself, but her mind churned with images of Elias in that room, trembling, fighting himself, gripping the piano, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. She had never seen a man struggle with emotion the way he did, not wildly or aggressively, but with an intensity that seemed to tear at him from the inside. She did not understand it fully yet. Something about it made her chest ache. She walked back into the main lounge where the wind roared like a beast outside. Elias followed several minutes later, though he stayed near the shadows, keeping distance, as if physical space alone could keep his emotions contained. The red lights flickered again, and without warning, the entire penthouse went dark. The sudden blackout swallowed the room in a suffocating blanket of darkness. Mira gasped and reached out blindly, her hand brushing the edge of a marble counter. The temperature had dropped enough that her breath formed small clouds in front of her face. Elias's voice came from somewhere near the windows, low and tense. "Stay still. The generators went offline. The storm must have killed the secondary backup." Mira felt her pulse spike. "What does that mean for the building?" "It means we are running on minimal emergency power for now," he said. But the tightness in his voice told her he was not sure how long even that would last. The room was almost silent, except for the distant thunder of the storm and the faint sound of Elias's breath, uneven and strained, as if he were fighting the rise again. Mira's eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness until she could make out his silhouette, standing rigid near the floor-to-ceiling windows. She stepped carefully toward the faint red light reflecting off the storm clouds outside. "Elias, are you all right?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he pressed his palm flat against the cold glass, as if grounding himself. His shoulders rose and fell in shaky bursts. "This night is too much," he said finally, voice cracking near to end. "The outage, the breach, this storm, and you here." He stopped, as if the words pulled too much truth out of him. Mira stood a few feet away, respecting the distance he seemed to need, but she could not ignore the tremor in his breath. She took one careful step closer, slow enough that he could stop her if he wanted. "What about me?" she asked softly. His head turned toward her. Even in the dim red glow, she could see the turmoil in his eyes. Everything he whispered. "You make me feel everything." She felt her own breath catch, but before she could respond, another blast of wind slammed the building, causing the window frames to creak under pressure. Mira stumbled sideways, catching herself on the arm of a sofa. Elias moved reflexively, as though to reach for her, but stopped himself mid-motion, fingers curling into a fist at his side. His breath hitched with the effort of restraint. "Are you hurt?" he asked through clenched teeth. "No, I am fine," she said, placing a hand on her chest to steady her heartbeat. He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. The room went silent again, except for the storm's howl. Mira felt the weight of something unspoken pressing between them, heavy and electric. She wondered if she should say something, anything, to pull him back from the edge she sensed he was teetering on. "Elias," she whispered, "what are you afraid will happen?" His gaze lifted to hers slowly. Even in the shadows, his eyes shone with a rawness that made her stomach twist. "I am afraid of losing control," he said, "and I am afraid of what that means with you here." Mira took a slow breath. "You think you will hurt me?" "No," he said quickly, voice sharp with sincerity. "Never." "Then what is it?" He hesitated for a long moment, as if searching for words he had hidden from himself for years. "When my emotions rise, I cannot shut them down. I feel too much too fast. It overwhelms my system. Sometimes my hands shake. Sometimes I cannot think clearly. Sometimes my reactions are too intense." Mira listened, her heart tightening at the vulnerability he allowed himself. "It is not violence," he continued. "It is not rage. It is intensity, attachment, connection. It is wanting too strongly. It is feeling too deeply. It is more than I know how to handle." Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold air. "You are telling me you feel that with me?" He pressed his hand to his forehead, as if the admission pained him. "Yes." Mira swallowed. "Why?" "I do not know," he said, voice breaking. "You walked into my life, and everything I have spent years stabilizing is slipping. You make me feel things I buried because they were too strong, too heavy, too dangerous." The confession settled between them, like a crackling flame warming the room in a way the broken heating system could not. Mira stepped closer, still leaving a respectful distance, her voice low and steady. "You are not dangerous." His jaw tightened. "You do not know that." She shook her head, even though he could barely see it. "I know what danger looks like, Elias, and this is not it. What I see is a man who feels deeply. That is not a flaw. That is human." He stared at her as if her words were a foreign language. His breath grew more ragged. Mira hesitated, then asked the question she had been afraid to put into words. "What do you feel right now?" Silence filled the room so thick it felt tangible. His voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. Everything. Mira felt a tug inside her, a pull toward him strong enough that she had to stop herself from closing the distance. The lack of light only amplified the intensity between them, turning the darkness into something intimate, almost protective. The storm outside roared, but inside the penthouse, something shifted, something softened, something broke open. Mira said quietly, "Elias, you do not have to hide from me." His eyes glistened with something raw. "I do not know how to be around someone who makes me feel this much," he whispered. Mira took a small step forward. "Then let me help you breathe through it." He inhaled sharply, chest rising as though her words reached through the storm inside him. She did not touch him. She only breathed with him slow and steady, matching the rhythm she hoped he could follow. His chest gradually loosened his breath, evening out though still shaky. The tension in the room eased, but only slightly. He looked at her with a vulnerability that felt like a turning point. "Why are you not afraid of me?" he asked. Mira felt her voice tremble when she answered, "Because you are afraid for me, not of me. And because everything about you tonight tells me you are fighting to stay gentle, not struggling to hold something violent back." Elias closed his eyes, his face softening at the edges. For a moment she thought he might collapse from the sheer emotional weight he carried. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at her as if she were the only steady point in a world spinning out of control. The storm pressed harder against the building. The lights flickered again. The temperature dipped lower. And in the darkness of the penthouse, Elias Wolf allowed himself, for the first time in years, to truly look at someone without his walls, without restraint, without the armor he had built since childhood. Mira Dalton stood across from him, wrapped in his sweater, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold air, and he knew with painful clarity that he had already crossed a line he could never return from. She had become the truth he could no longer outrun, and this long night with all its darkness and chaos had pulled that truth into the open. Darkness settled over the penthouse like a velvet curtain, thick and heavy, muffling every sound except the storm that raged violently outside. Mira stood still, her heartbeat steady but alert, her eyes adjusting to the faint glow leaking in from the snow-covered skyline. Elias's silhouette was tense by the window, his breath uneven, his frame outlined by the faint red emergency lights that flickered against the glass. The blackout had forced the space into an intimate stillness, and in that stillness Mira felt something shift, something unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. She moved closer, slow and careful, until she could almost feel the tension vibrating off him. "Elias," she whispered, her voice low and steady. "Are you with me?" His jaw clenched at the sound of her voice, and he lowered his head as if trying to contain the storm inside him. "I am here," he said, but the words were strained, as if each syllable cost him effort. Mira's eyes softened. "You can talk to me." He let out a breath that sounded like surrender. "Talking is not the problem. Feeling is the problem." She stepped closer until they were only a few feet apart. The dim light cut across his face, revealing an expression she had not yet seen from him, raw, wounded on the edge of breaking open. Mira waited. After a moment, he spoke again. "I learned young that emotions were weaknesses. In my family, you survive by controlling every part of yourself. My father always said feelings make you sloppy. My mother said they make you vulnerable. So I taught myself to shut everything down." Mira listened silently as his voice dropped to a broken whisper. "I was good at burying things, Until you. Her breath caught, but she stayed still, letting him find his rhythm. The emergency lights flickered and cast flashes of red across the room like distant lightning illuminating the shape of him, the rise and fall of his chest, the tremor in his hands. My childhood home was a competition, he continued. Love was conditional, approval even more so. He paused, swallowing hard. I was praised for being calm, stoic, untouchable. If I cried, I was punished. If I reacted, I was shamed. My parents believed that emotional discipline made leaders, but what they really taught me was fear. Fear of being seen, fear of wanting things, fear of anyone getting close enough to hurt me. Mira felt her heart twist. You do not have to perform for me, she whispered. He looked at her as if he had never heard such words before. I know. That is what terrifies me. Another gust of wind slammed into the building, shaking the windows. Mira steadied herself and asked softly, what happened after that? Elias ran a hand through his hair in a slow, trembling motion. I built Wolf Technologies with the same discipline my parents taught me, except I used it to escape them. I cut everyone out, kept everything controlled. And he paused, jaw tightening. There was one person I let in. Mira sensed where this was going and braced herself. Her name was Talia. We dated for 2 years. She told me I was too intense, too much, too overwhelming when I cared. She said my emotions felt like pressure. She said she always felt watched, as if my attention was a weight she could not carry. The words spilled from him like wounds reopening. When she left, I told myself it was proof that feeling was a liability, that if I stayed detached, people would not run from me. He lifted his eyes to Mira with a vulnerability that made the room feel warmer despite the cold. And then you walked in. Everything I buried came back. Fast, loud, impossible to contain. It feels like drowning and resurfacing at the same time. Mira stepped closer, her voice barely above breath. And you think that is dangerous? I know it is, he whispered. Because you make me feel things I cannot regulate. I cannot hide. You make me want things I should not want. Mira's breath trembled. What things? He did not move closer, but the honesty in his voice felt like he had crossed the distance anyway. I want to protect you, to be near you, to touch you, and that terrifies me because when I want something, I want it completely. Mira felt heat rise under her skin. Elias's breath shook as the emergency lights blinked again. It is not just you, he added. Tonight, everything is spiraling. The breach, the outage, the storm. My body goes into overload when too many things happen at once. I feel every stimulus like it is magnified. It is like my system is miswired. His phone buzzed on the counter. Even without seeing the screen, he knew it was another alert. Mira reached for it, but Elias said quietly, "Leave it. If I look at another headline tonight, I will break." Mira set the phone aside and stepped close enough that she could sense the warmth of his breath in the cold air. Her voice softened. "Your emotions are not too much for me." He shook his head. "You say that now? But everyone who came before you ran when they saw the real me." Mira lifted her chin. Then maybe they did not deserve to see the real you. His eyes softened with something fragile. Mira. The way he said her name felt like it came from somewhere deep inside him. She inhaled a trembling breath. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. Why me?" He stared at her for a long pause that felt like gravity tightening around them. "Because you do not recoil from intensity," he said finally. "Because when you look at me, I do not feel broken. I feel seen. And that is something I do not know how to handle." She felt her chest constrict, her body pulled toward him as if by instinct. Then something in the darkness shifted. He leaned against the wall, eyes closing, chest rising in uneven waves. Mira recognized the signs of another emotional surge. "Elias, breathe with me," she whispered, stepping closer. He opened his eyes full of stormlight and raw fear. "I do not want to lose control in front of you." She shook her head. Control is not what I am asking from you. I'm asking for honesty. He held her gaze for a long moment before he exhaled shakily, letting the tension drop from his shoulders as much as he could manage. She breathed with him, slow, steady, grounding breaths. The lights flickered again, and Mira suddenly found herself in almost total darkness, guided only by the faint outline of him. She could hear his heart pounding through the silence, could feel the heat of him, even without touching. Elias whispered something so quietly she almost missed it. I do not know how to want someone gently. She felt the words like a spark down her spine. You do not have to want me gently, she whispered back. You just have to want me truthfully. The room went still. The storm outside paused as if listening. Elias opened his eyes fully. The next words he spoke cracked him open completely. Mira, you are the first person I have wanted in years. Wanted in a way I cannot suppress. Wanted in a way that terrifies me. Mira stepped close enough that her breath mingled with his and the warmth bridged the space between them. Then let it terrify you, she said softly. He let out a shaky exhale that carried 10 years of restraint unraveling. His voice broke when he whispered, I am afraid of wanting you too much. She felt her heart ache. Then want me honestly. His breath trembled. Mira, the penthouse went silent as the storm outside pounded against the glass, but inside, between two people standing inches apart, something far more powerful shifted. A truth long buried rose to the surface. Elias looked at her with a confession that glowed in the faint red light. You are the only person who has ever made me feel like losing control might not destroy me. Mira's breath caught as the darkness wrapped around them like a cocoon, and in that fragile electric stillness, he whispered the words he had been afraid to say aloud. I think I could fall for you, and I do not know how to stop it. When the power surged back to life, it happened so abruptly that both Mira and Elias froze where they stood. Warm golden light flooded the penthouse, replacing the red emergency glow and illuminating every detail that darkness had softened. The marble floors shimmered. The storm battered against the windows with renewed force. The heated air began circulating again, thawing the cold that had settled into their skin. But none of that mattered as much as the sight suddenly laid bare before them. Elias standing inches away from her chest, rising in uneven breaths, eyes still blown wide, with the intensity of everything he had just confessed. Mira blinked momentarily, disoriented by the shift in light, but when her gaze locked onto his, something inside her tightened. In darkness, emotions had been abstract colors. In light, they became unmistakably real. Elias swallowed hard, his jaw tensing, as if he felt the weight of his own vulnerability more sharply now that there was nowhere left to hide. She watched his throat, moved the subtle tremble in his fingers the way his gaze kept flickering down, as if battling himself. Mira, he whispered, voice roughened as if he had spoken her name in his mind 100 times before saying it aloud. The light caught his face, revealing the raw war playing out in his expression. He looked as if he was trying to step back, to rebuild the distance, but his body refused to obey. His breath grew heavier, faster, like something inside him was slipping. Mira felt her heart pound in her chest, but she did not move away. She took a single small breath, and that tiny motion broke whatever fragile barrier he had clung to. She lifted her hand, slowly giving him every second to stop her, and placed it lightly on his arm. The moment her skin touched his, Elias inhaled sharply. Not a gasp, not a warning, something deeper, something that sounded like surrender. His entire body shuddered beneath her fingertips, and she felt his muscles tighten as if he were holding back a tidal wave with sheer willpower. Mira, he whispered again, but this time the words sounded fractured like silk tearing. She could feel the pulse beneath his skin racing uncontrollably. Elias Wolf was unraveling in front of her, and not in anger or fear, but in emotion so powerful it felt like the air between them was vibrating. She slid her hand a little higher up his arm, gentle, steady grounding. His eyes fluttered shut for a second, his jaw clenching as he drew in a sharp breath. "This is what I meant," he said, voice trembling, "when I told you I lose control." Mira stepped closer until his warmth brushed against her despite the distance he tried desperately to maintain. "And I told you I am not afraid of you," she whispered. He opened his eyes, and the storm outside had nothing on the storm behind them. He looked at her as if she were the reason he had been holding on and the reason he was letting go. His voice grew unsteady. "When I feel something, I feel it completely. I do not know how to ration it. I do not know how to make it small." Mira exhaled softly. "Then do not make it small." The words struck something deep in him. His breath hitched, and he took a single step toward her, then another. His restraint, which had been painfully visible for hours, finally slipped free of his grip. His hand lifted slowly, as if weighed down by every fear he had ever carried, and hovered near her cheek. His fingers trembled inches from her skin. His voice cracked. "Tell me to stop." She shook her head gently. "I will not." His breath grew ragged. "I do not want to hurt you. You are not hurting me." His eyes darkened, emotions swirling in them like a current too strong to fight. "Mira," he whispered, and hearing her name spoken in that voice made her knees weaken. He lowered his forehead until it nearly brushed hers, his breath warm against her lips, his hands shaking with the force of everything he held back for too long. She whispered, "Elias, it is okay to feel." His composure broke completely at that. He let out a shuddering exhale, and his hand finally touched her cheek. The moment his skin met hers, it felt like the world snapped into focus. A tremor ran through him, deep and uncontrollable, and he whispered something raw, something that sounded close to, "I cannot stop this." "Then do not," she breathed. The storm outside howled as if echoing his surrender. Elias leaned in touch, trembling but deliberate, the kind of touch that comes from wanting too much for too long, and finally realizing the dam cannot hold forever. The closeness consumed them, the warmth of his breath mixing with hers, his thumb brushing her cheek, an emotion too tender to be anything but confession. Mira's hands slid up his chest, steadying him, grounding him. He inhaled sharply at her touch, as though it ignited something in him he never meant for anyone to see. His voice broke. "I have wanted to touch you since the moment I first saw you," she whispered, "then touch me." The last of his restraint shattered. He pulled her closer, not forcefully but with an intensity that made her breath catch. His forehead pressed to hers, their breaths falling in sync, the world around them disappearing until nothing existed but the powerful pull drawing them together. He whispered, "I cannot think when I am near you." "Then do not think, feel." He let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and his hands cupped her face gently, reverently, as if she were something fragile and irreplaceable. Mira leaned in the slightest bit, the invitation unmistakable. Elias closed the remaining distance. His lips met hers in a slow, aching kiss that felt like everything he had buried for a decade, breaking through the surface at once. It was not frantic. It was not careless. It was deep, warm, trembling, a confession more honest than any words he had spoken. Mira kissed him back with the same steady courage she carried through every part of her life, and he shuddered, both hands moving to hold her as if she were the only anchor in a world spinning too wildly. When they finally parted for breath, Elias pressed his forehead to hers again, his voice barely a whisper. "This is me losing control." Mira brushed her thumb along his jaw. "Then lose it with me." He closed his eyes, breathing her in, and whispered the truth that sealed the moment. "I do not know how to want you quietly." And Mira Breath, trembling against his lips, answered softly, "Then want me loudly." The storm outside raged, but inside that penthouse, Elias Wolf fell apart in the safest way he ever had, and Mira Dalton held every piece of him without fear. Morning arrived quietly, almost shyly, as if afraid to disturb what the night had created. The blizzard had softened into a pale hush, leaving Manhattan draped in silver every rooftop, frosted every street, muffled under thick, untouched snow. Light filtered through the expansive windows in a calm golden wash that warmed the marble floors and shimmered across the penthouse with a gentleness that felt unreal after the violent storm of emotions from the night before. Mira blinked awake, her body cocooned in a plush blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and something warm she recognized instantly as Elias. She realized she was lying on the long sofa near the panoramic windows, wrapped securely, as though someone had taken great care to make sure she would not be cold. She sat up slowly, heart fluttering, as memories of the night before washed over her like waves, soft and overwhelming. His confession, his trembling hands, his kiss. The way he whispered her name, like it meant something he had never allowed himself to want. She touched her lips, still feeling the echo of his intensity and the softness beneath it. Her pulse quickened not in fear, but in the quiet realization that something between them had shifted permanently. She looked around, noticing the faint sound of movement coming from the open kitchen. When she turned her head, the sight stunned her for a moment. Elias Wolf, the billionaire, who rarely let anyone see him undone, was standing barefoot in sweatpants and a dark shirt, hair-tousled sleeves pushed up, fumbling awkwardly with a frying pan like a man trying to remember how the world worked. He glanced up and froze when their eyes met his expression, shifting from surprise to something softer, warmer, deeper. "Morning, Mira," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse as though he had not slept much, but it carried none of the panic or restraint she had heard from him the previous night. It was stripped down gentle in a way she had never imagined he was capable of. Mira smiled shyly. "You are cooking." He looked down at the pan, as if only now remembering it was in his hand, trying to. He set it down, wiping his palms against his shirt nervously. "I was not sure what you liked." She stood wrapping the blanket around her shoulders as she walked closer. The warmth in the room contrasted with the crisp glow of snow outside. Elias watched her approach with the same look he had worn during the storm, a look that said he felt too much, but was trying not to be overwhelmed by it. Mira studied him. "You did not have to make breakfast." He swallowed. "I wanted to." He hesitated, running a hand through his messy hair, the vulnerability in him clearer than the sunrise behind him. "After last night, I thought you might be confused, or that you might feel pressured. I did not want you waking up thinking I expected anything from you." Mira stopped a few feet away, the sunlight warming her skin. She took a gentle breath. "I do not regret anything from last night." His entire body seemed to exhale with relief, but then tension flickered across his features again. He stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance. "Mira, last night was the first time I let myself feel something real in years. But today the world is back, and you should have space to decide how you feel without my emotions crowding you." His eyes drifted toward the sleek tablet glowing on the counter, its screen blank now, but clearly used earlier. She sensed immediately what he had been trying to hide. "What happened with the breach?" she asked. He stiffened, then forced himself to meet her gaze. "The board is panicking. The media is circling like vultures. Our stock dropped again this morning." His breath hitched slightly. "Everything feels like it is collapsing, and I do not want to place the weight of that on you." Mira stepped closer, gently nudging his shoulder with her hand. "You do not have to carry it alone." He looked down, his voice thinning. "I am not used to someone saying that and meaning it." She felt the ache in his words and touched his arm again, grounding him with a steadiness he seemed to draw strength from. Elias, what happened between us last night was not confusion, it was connection. And connection does not disappear when the sun comes up. He closed his eyes briefly, as though the tenderness in her voice pierced right through him. When he looked at her again, his eyes were softer than she had ever seen. "I do not want you to leave," he whispered, "but I do not want my world to hurt you." She stepped closer until the sunlight pooled around both of them. Her voice softened. "Maybe instead of trying to protect me from your world, you can let me be part of it." He stared at her emotions flickering unshaped across his face. His fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to reach for her. And then something in him broke open again. "Maybe I want that more than I should." She smiled, feeling her own emotions swell. "Breakfast is burning," she whispered gently. He spun around, startled, rushing back to the pan that was now smoking slightly. Mira giggled, the sound blending with the soft morning light. He waved the smoke away with a frustrated sigh. "I swear I am better at running a multi-billion-dollar company than frying eggs." "You are doing fine," she teased. "No, I am not," he said, but there was a smile tugging at his mouth, now soft and crooked. And Mira realized this was another version of him she was witnessing one even fewer people had ever seen. But the gentle moment was disrupted when his phone buzzed insistently on the counter. Elias tensed. Mira watched him hesitate before picking it up. He glanced at the screen, jaw tightening. Mira could not see the message, but his shoulders stiffened, and his breath grew shallow, the same way it had before his panic spikes. She stepped closer. Elias breathed. His eyes flickered to her. "I am fine," he said, though his voice was strained. She rested a hand on his arm. He relaxed slightly, but placed the phone face down without opening the message. Mira tilted her head. "Do you want to talk about it?" He shook his head slowly. "If I let it in now, I will lose the morning, and I do not want to lose this morning." Her eyebrows softened. "You will not lose it." He swallowed. "I already lose control too easily around you." Mira felt her chest tighten. "Elias, last night was not you losing control. It was you being honest." His eyes softened in a way that made every breath Mira took feel warmer. She reached for the blanket and adjusted it around her shoulders. Elias watched her, something like affection deepening in his gaze. The air between them shifted again softer now, full of the morning afterglow. Mira glanced toward the windows, seeing the city blanketed in shimmering white. "We survived the blizzard," she said quietly. He stepped closer, barely. She smiled faintly. "You look exhausted." "I did not sleep much," he admitted. "Not because of the storm." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. He moved closer, voice dropping. "I kept thinking about you on that sofa, and how much I wanted to sit beside you, but I did not trust myself to stay at a safe distance." Her breath caught. "Elias, you are allowed to want things." "Not if wanting them overwhelms the person I care about," he replied. Mira's heart softened entirely. "I am not overwhelmed. I am here, with you." His eyes shimmered with layered emotion, and he stepped close enough that the sunlight cast both their shadows across the marble floor. For a moment they simply stood there, breathing the same air, letting the morning ease into them. Elias lifted a hand slowly, as if testing whether he was allowed, then gently touched a strand of her hair where it fell across her cheek. "You deserve a morning without crisis," he murmured. She smiled. "Then stay in this moment with me." He nodded, breath trembling. "I want to," but the truth lingered in the air like an unanswered question. How long would this quiet morning last before reality fractured it? She felt the shift coming, something heavy waiting to unfold. But for now, in that golden calm after the storm, Mira and Elias stood together, connected by everything they had survived the night before and everything they had not yet said aloud. And for the first time in years, Elias Wolf let himself feel hope. The city had begun to stir beneath the blanket of melting snow by the time Mira stepped out into the cold hallway outside the penthouse, her mind racing with the weight of the morning's revelation. The sunlight that had poured warmly into the penthouse now felt distant, replaced by a creeping chill that sank into her bones as she replayed the sound of her phone vibrating against the sofa cushion. She had answered the call reluctantly, knowing any call from the hospital could upend her fragile peace, and the words of the nurse replayed in her ears with painful clarity. Your mother's condition is worsening. Her surgery must be scheduled within 2 weeks, or her heart may not withstand the strain. The cost is still the same, $48,000 due immediately to begin prep. Mira had thanked the nurse, her voice calm even as her stomach twisted, and she had stepped away from Elias before the fear in her eyes could betray her. She had barely hung up when her maid agency contacted her with the unexpected news that a family on Long Island was requesting a new live-in maid for double her current pay, with room and board included. She had stared at the message, palms cold, as the truth settled with the heaviness of an anchor. She could save her mother's life if she took the job, but it meant leaving Manhattan, leaving the penthouse, leaving Elias. Even thinking his name made her chest tighten. She had not meant for her footsteps to echo as she returned to the living area, but Elias looked up instantly, reading her expression, as if her face were a language he had studied for years. His breath hitched a subtle but unmistakable sound. Mira, what happened? She swallowed her fingers, trembling slightly, around her phone. I need to go home for a bit, just for a few hours. He studied her, his brows pulling together. Is your mother all right? She forced a nod. I just need to check on something. His eyes held hers longer than she could bear, like he sensed the truth slipping between her words, but he did not push. He only said quietly, come back. She could not promise that. She whispered, I will try. And with that, she slipped out the door before her resolve broke completely. Outside, the streets of Manhattan had turned into a maze of slush and broken branches. The snowplows had only just begun their work, and the city moved slowly, cautiously, still shaken by the previous night's blizzard. Mira made her way to the subway, where melted snow dripped from steel beams, and people huddled near heaters, their breath misting in the cold air. She clutched her phone tightly, staring at the email from the hospital again and again, each reading cutting deeper than the last. She tried to imagine staying in Manhattan, tried to imagine telling Elias everything, tried to picture him standing in the kitchen with soft morning eyes and steady hands and believing that somehow he could fix this. But she knew what his world cost him. She knew the panic, the emotional overload, the storms inside him. The last thing she wanted was to add her mother's life to the list of burdens already pulling him under. So she told herself leaving was the right thing, even as her heart splintered. The ride home was a blur of screeching rails and flickering lights. When she reached the apartment in Queens, her mother was asleep on the worn gray couch, her breathing shallow but steady. Mira knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, a silent vow rising in her chest. I will not lose you, not like this. She checked the cabinets, counted the pills reviewed, the list of medical appointments pinned to the fridge, and each detail sharpened her fear. She called the maid agency back. I will take the job, she said, the words tasting like iron. When can you start? The agent asked. Tomorrow. The agent confirmed, and Mira's fate sealed itself like a door closing with no keyhole. She returned to her room, packed her things silently, setting aside her penthouse keycard with trembling hands. When she held it, memories of Elias's trembling voice and warm breath rose like embers. She forced herself to set the card in the envelope she labeled Return. but her chest tightened so sharply she had to sit down. Leaving him felt like tearing away a part of herself she had only just rediscovered. But she had no choice. At sunset, she left the apartment again, planning to drop off the keycard at the agency after sending a final message to Elias. But as she stepped onto her block, the sound of pounding footsteps on snow filled her ears. She lifted her head and froze. At the end of the street, barely visible through the falling dusk, Elias Wolf was running toward her, through the snowsuit coat, half-buttoned hair, wind-blown cheeks flushed crimson from the cold. Her breath caught. He should not be here. He was not built for the Bronx. Not built for the slush-filled sidewalks, the cracked pavement, the flickering streetlights. But he was here, for her. When he reached her, he stopped inches away, a breathless snow clinging to his hair, and lashes his chest heaving as if he had sprinted the entire way. Mira stared at him, stunned. "Elias, what are you doing here?" He shook his head, breath-breaking. "You left without saying anything. I could feel something was wrong." She looked away. "I did not want to make things harder for you. The storm, the breach, the press you're bored. You have enough to worry about." His eyes darkened with something fierce. "You are not a burden. You are the only thing keeping me from falling apart." Her breath trembled in the freezing air. "Elias." He stepped closer, his voice low and fractured. "Do not pull away from me. Not after last night. Not after everything we said." She swallowed tears, blurring her vision. "My mom needs surgery, urgently, and I cannot pay for it. I got offered a live-in job in Long Island with double pay. I have to take it. I do not have a choice." Elias stared at her as if the ground were disappearing beneath him. "You think I care about you leaving because of a job. You think this is about what you can or cannot give me." "Mira, I am terrified of losing you." She shook her head, tears falling. "Elias, your world is falling apart. The breach, the stocks, the press. You cannot afford another distraction." "Distraction," he whispered, stunned. "Is that what you think you are?" She looked down. He gently lifted her chin with trembling fingers. "Mira, look at me." His voice cracked raw and pleading. "You are the only person who makes me want to fight. The only person who makes me remember I am human. You think I lose control around you. I do. But not because it's dangerous. Because it is the first time losing control feels like living." Her tears spilled faster. Elias stepped closer, the cold turning his breath into silver fog between them. "Do not leave me," he whispered, voice shaking. "I lose control because I care, and I am done fighting that." Mira pressed a trembling hand to his chest, feeling his heart thundering beneath her palm. She whispered, "I am scared." He cupped her face gently, reverently. "Then let me be scared with you." Snow drifted around them, settling on their hair and lashes like fragile stars. Elias lowered his forehead to hers, breath warm against her lips. "Stay." Mira's breath hitched. "Elias, please stay." The plea broke something inside her. She leaned into him, letting the truth spill in a trembling whisper. "I do not want to leave you." His hands trembled as he held her face, and with a voice that shook through every syllable, he whispered, "Then do not." And in the silver dusk of a Bronx street buried in snow, Mira Dalton finally let herself fall into the arms of the man who had been her storm and her sanctuary. Their lips met in a slow, aching, shattering kiss that felt like every confession they had not been brave enough to say aloud. Snowflakes melted on their cheeks, mingling with tears as the city lights flickered on one by one around them. And for the first time in years, Elias Wolf kissed someone like he was choosing life. Elias had never imagined that the morning after a kiss in the snow would feel more terrifying than any board meeting, any data breach, or any moment of emotional overload he had ever endured yet. When he woke on Mira's small couch in her queen's apartment, wrapped awkwardly in a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender detergent, His first thought was not panic, but a profound, frightening sense of peace. Mira was standing in the narrow kitchen, her hair slightly messy, wearing an oversized cardigan that slipped off one shoulder, boiling water for tea, while the winter sun cast soft beams across the worn linoleum floor. When she turned and saw him awake, her eyes softened, then flickered with worry. "Are you okay?" she whispered, as though afraid a loud voice might shatter something fragile between them. Elias sat up, slowly rubbing the back of his neck. "I should be asking you that," he said, voice rough. "You made a life-changing decision last night." She looked down at the tea mug in her hands. "I made the decision long before that, Elias. I just finally admitted it to myself." He exhaled, chest rising with a mixture of relief and fear, because wanting her close and deserving her were two different things, and he was terrified he had blurred the line. Mira handed him the mug and sat beside him. Her knee brushed his leg, a small contact that sent warmth up his spine. "I'm staying in Manhattan," she said, steady now, "but I still have to find the money for my mom. I cannot ignore that." Elias nodded, swallowing hard. "Let me help." He expected a refusal, expected her to retreat, but Mira only met his gaze with quiet firmness. "I cannot take money from you, not like that, not because we are, whatever we are." He clenched the mug tightly. "It is not charity, Mira. It is care. It is choice." She shook her head. "I need to stand on my own 2 feet." For a moment, the room felt too small, too fragile. But then she added softly, "But that does not mean I do not want you beside me through it." The words hit him harder than any storm. By noon, Elias insisted on driving Mira back to the penthouse so she could collect her belongings and formally end her position with the Maid agency. As they stepped into the building lobby, a group of reporters swarmed the entrance, shouting questions about the data breach, demanding statements. Elias stiffened, breath shortening, as the noise pressed in on him like a tidal wave. Mira immediately stepped in front of him, facing the crowd with a steady strength that belied her size. "He needs space," she said firmly, guiding him inside like she had done it 100 times before. His security team rushed forward, escorting them through a back elevator, and Elias leaned against the mirrored wall, trying to breathe. Mira touched his hand, gently grounding him. "I am right here." The words steadied him more effectively than any therapy session ever had. Back inside the penthouse, Mira packed her uniform and small belongings, while Elias spoke to his executive team from the glass office, his voice hoarse but determined. The board was panicking, the media was hostile, and the hacker behind the data breach had just taunted Wolf Technologies with another encrypted message. Elias's pulse spiked, his breathing tightening again, but then he saw Mira standing quietly in a doorway, watching him. Their eyes met, and something inside him calmed, as if the storm had finally found direction. After the call, he sank into the chair and rubbed his eyes. "Everything has fallen apart," he murmured. Mira stepped in, resting her hand over his. "Then let it fall," she whispered. "We will build it again, together." The word together felt like a lifeline thrown into an ocean he had been drowning in for years. Over the next week, the city slowly thawed from the blizzard, and the pieces of Elias's life began to rearrange themselves. He started therapy again, this time weekly, with a specialist in emotional dysregulation. Mira attended the first session with him, sitting silently beside him until he loosened the grip on the chair he had been white-knuckling. Afterward, he admitted quietly, "I want to be better for you." She corrected him softly, "Be better for you first. That is who I want." Elias found himself smiling for the first time in days. Meanwhile, Mira returned to her interior design textbooks each night, her fingers tracing lines on architectural sketches she had abandoned years ago. Elias noticed quietly, opened a new scholarship line under Wolf Foundation and awarded Mira a private grant with no strings attached, marked as merit-based talent initiative. Mira stared at the email for minutes before whispering through tears, "You did this." Elias shook his head gently. "I only opened the door. You are the one walking through it." Her gratitude was a warmth that seeped into him like sunlight. But the world was not done testing them. On the fourth morning, federal agents and NYPD cybercrime investigators tracked down the hacker responsible for the breach, a disgruntled former contractor. When Elias received the notification, he froze mid-sentence, eyes widening. Mira, reading his face, walked over slowly. "Is it over?" He breathed out a long, shaky exhale. "They got him, but I still have to address the public." Mira touched his cheek thumb, brushing lightly along the line of detention at his jaw. "You will tell the truth, and I will be right there." True to her promise, she stood hidden behind the curtain during the press conference, watching as Elias stepped before dozens of cameras. His voice trembled at first, fingers shaking on the podium, but when his eyes flicked toward the side stage and he saw her, something steadied inside him. He delivered the entire speech with honesty and humility, taking responsibility without shame, acknowledging vulnerabilities he once hid even from himself. The press responded not with hostility, but with surprising empathy. By evening, Wolf Technology's stock began to climb inch by inch. When Elias returned backstage, Mira threw her arms around him, whispering, "You did it?" He buried his face in her neck, unsteady with relief. "No, we did." Their lives began to intertwine seamlessly. She moved into a renovated suite on the 59th floor, not as staff, but as a resident, though she often fell asleep in his arms in the 62nd floor library, where he felt safest. They shared late-night talks, quiet breakfasts, healing silences. She studied, he rebuilt. She soothed the storms inside him. He cherished the strength inside her. And without announcing it or labeling it, they chose each other every day in 1,000 unsaid ways, until choosing each other became the only life either of them wanted. 1 year later, the 62nd floor no longer felt like a forbidden realm of echoes and shadows, but a space filled with warm lamplight, soft music, and the scent of cedar that had become a quiet signature of their life together. The storm of that winter night had become a memory they carried like a turning point. A before and after that shaped every step since. Mira pushed open the door to the piano room, a place she had once entered by accident and fear now transformed into the heart of their home. Sunlight spilled through the towering windows, catching tiny motes of dust that floated like gold in the air. Elias was sitting at the piano bench with his back to her, his fingers resting idly on the keys, as if he had been playing moments before she arrived. He turned when he sensed her presence, his features softening into the smile he reserved only for her. "You are home early," he murmured, rising to meet her halfway. Her heart warmed at the sound of home, because this room, this floor, this man, all of it had become a place she no longer felt like she was trespassing in. She stepped into his arms, their foreheads touching gently, a silent greeting they never grew tired of. "How did the class go?" he asked quietly, brushing his thumb over her cheek. Mira's eyes brightened. "My final design proposal was approved. I start my internship next month." Elias exhaled a breath of pride that almost trembled. "I knew you would," she laughed softly. "You hoped I would. I did the work." He kissed her temple. "You built yourself a new life. I just kept the light on while you did." They moved to the piano, where sheet music was scattered, like small markers of how far they had come. Mira traced her fingers across the keys, remembering the night she first stepped into this room and saw him unraveling under the weight of emotions he could not contain. Now he stood behind her steady, grounded, a man who had rewritten the rules of his life, piece by piece. Therapy had become a regular part of his schedule, not out of obligation, but out of choice, and the storms that once ruled him had softened into tides he knew how to navigate. She turned to him, eyes warm. "Elias, do you remember what you said the first night we met?" His jaw tightened slightly at the memory. "I told you not to come closer because I would lose control." She nodded. "And now," he cupped her face gently, "now losing control is just another way of loving you." The words settled in her chest like sunlight. Elias took a slow breath, then reached into the drawer of the piano bench. Mira stilled. He held a small velvet box in his hand, the deep navy fabric catching the golden afternoon light. Her breath caught even before he opened it. The ring inside, Yetre, was simple, elegant, a single oval diamond set in a slender platinum band that reflected the room like a promise carved in light. Elias sank to one knee, not in a grand gesture but in a quiet surrender, his eyes locked on hers, with a depth that made her entire world still. "Mira." His voice trembled with emotion he no longer feared. "You walked into the room I feared most. You stayed when every part of me tried to push you away. You taught me how to feel without drowning. You showed me that control is not love, but fear, and that love is the only thing I never want to hold back from." He swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "You made my world softer. You made me stronger. You made me alive." Mira's eyes flooded her hand, covering her mouth, as tears slipped down her cheeks. Elias held the ring up to her, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Will you stay with me? Not because I need you to calm the storms, but because you are the home I choose every day." She fell to her knees in front of him, emotion overwhelming her laughter and tears mingling as she nodded and whispered yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. Elias exhaled a breath that shook through his entire body as he slipped the ring onto her finger, his forehead pressing to hers as they both smiled through tears. Outside the windows, Manhattan glowed beneath the evening sky, the city lights flickering on one by one, like stars rising from the ground. And in the room he once feared, where he once braced himself against the walls to keep from breaking, Elias Wolf kissed the woman who had turned his storms into stillness, his fear into devotion, his solitude into a life worth living. And the future stretched before them, bright and unwavering, as they held each other close and let the world fall away. If this story touched your heart, even a little, if you felt the quiet storm of two people learning to love without fear, then take a moment to breathe with them before you go. Stories like this are our reminder that even in a world that moves too fast, healing is still possible, connection is still real, and love is still worth believing in. If you want more stories filled with slow burn, romance, emotional tension, unexpected confessions, and characters who fight their way toward each other, no matter the storms around them, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of love resilience and the kind of cinematic magic that stays with you long after the video ends. And if you enjoyed this journey with Mira and Elias, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what moment hit you the hardest. Your words keep this community alive and help these stories reach more hearts around the world. Until the next story, remember this simple truth. Sometimes the place we fear the most becomes the home we were always meant to find.